You're my son.
I think you're mistaking me for someone else.
You're my son.
Daniel Carter had spent nearly 3 decades convincing the world that discipline could overcome almost anything. Every article written about him described the same remarkable journey. An orphan adopted as an infant, raised by 2 loving school teachers in a quiet Massachusetts suburb, first in his class throughout high school. A scholarship student who worked nights stocking supermarket shelves while studying business during the day. The ambitious young entrepreneur who transformed a struggling commercial property firm into one of the largest privately owned investment companies in New England. Journalists loved his story because it represented something comforting: hard work, perseverance, opportunity. The American dream packaged inside one man whose success seemed earned rather than inherited. Investors trusted him because his reputation had never carried even the smallest stain. Employees admired him because he remembered birthdays, visited sick co-workers in hospitals, and greeted janitors with the same respect he showed members of his executive board. His wife often joked that Daniel never entered a room without leaving at least one person feeling better than before he arrived. For years, everyone who knew him believed exactly the same thing. Daniel Carter was one of the good ones. His home reflected the life he had built. Nestled beside a quiet lake just outside Boston stood a beautiful stone estate surrounded by old maple trees and perfectly maintained gardens. Every Sunday morning, the Carter family gathered around the breakfast table without exception. Daniel insisted phones remain in another room until everyone finished eating. His wife, Laura Carter, loved those mornings because they reminded her that despite the enormous responsibilities attached to Daniel's business, he never stopped placing family first. Their daughter Emily had recently begun law school. Their youngest son Ethan planned to study engineering the following year. Dinner conversations often wandered from current events to family vacations, childhood memories, and playful arguments over who cheated most often during board games. Visitors frequently commented that the Carters seemed unusually close for a family carrying such demanding careers. Laura considered herself fortunate. She had married a man who never gave her reason to question his honesty. Daniel's adoptive parents had passed away several years earlier, leaving behind countless photo albums documenting every stage of his childhood. His mother, Margaret Carter, had labeled each album with careful handwriting. First steps, first day of school, summer at Cape Cod, Christmas traditions. Daniel occasionally opened those albums whenever work became overwhelming. Looking through them reminded him that success meant very little without remembering the people who helped create it. The photographs showed scraped knees, birthday cakes, family camping trips, piano recitals, Little League championships, and countless ordinary moments that together formed an extraordinary childhood. If anyone had searched those albums for evidence that Daniel's life contained hidden mysteries, they would have found absolutely nothing. Every photograph reinforced exactly the same story: a little boy deeply loved by parents who considered him their greatest blessing. There was only one thing missing. No photographs existed from before his adoption. As a child, Daniel had asked why. His mother always smiled gently before explaining that many adoption records from those years had been incomplete. She told him his biological parents had died only days after his birth in a terrible highway accident during a winter snowstorm. Social workers placed him temporarily into foster care before Margaret and her husband adopted him several months later. Daniel accepted the explanation without question. Children rarely investigate the stories given to them by the people they trust most. Why would they? Love teaches certainty long before it teaches skepticism. Even after becoming an adult, Daniel never searched for additional answers. Some adoptees spend years tracing biological relatives. Others feel no need. Daniel belonged firmly to the second group. As far as he was concerned, family had nothing to do with genetics. Margaret and Thomas Carter had changed diapers, attended graduations, comforted him after nightmares, applauded every achievement, and sacrificed countless opportunities so he could pursue his dreams. They were his parents. Nothing else mattered. At least, that was what he believed. The elderly maid who had interrupted the executive meeting earlier that morning was named Evelyn Brooks. Unlike Daniel, almost nobody inside Hawthorne Global Holdings knew anything about her life. She had worked for the building maintenance company for nearly 11 years. She always arrived before sunrise, finished cleaning executive offices before employees appeared, and quietly disappeared before evening meetings began. Most executives knew her only as the pleasant older woman who smiled politely while polishing conference tables or watering office plants. Few realized Evelyn had once dreamed of becoming a registered nurse before life interrupted those plans. Fewer still knew she spent every Friday afternoon visiting a small cemetery outside Worcester, where one gravestone carried no body beneath it. For 48 years, Evelyn had lived with a question nobody could answer. What really happened to her baby? She had been only 19 when she entered St. Matthew's County Hospital during the summer of 1978. The labor had been long and complicated. Doctors assured her everything would be all right. She remembered hearing her baby's first cry. She remembered seeing a tiny hand wrapped briefly around one of the nurse's fingers. Then everything became blurry as medication pulled her into unconsciousness. When she finally woke, a doctor quietly informed her that her son had died shortly after delivery due to unexpected complications. They advised against seeing the body because the injuries had been severe. Hospital administrators handled the burial arrangements themselves. Overwhelmed by grief, frightened, and completely alone, Evelyn believed every word. Years later, she often wondered why she had never demanded proof. The answer always remained painfully simple. She had trusted the people wearing white coats. Life moved forward because it had to. Evelyn eventually married a kind mechanic named Robert Brooks. Together, they raised 2 daughters who grew into caring adults with families of their own. Robert never pressured Evelyn to speak about the son she had lost. He simply sat beside her each anniversary, holding her hand whenever grief quietly resurfaced. After Robert passed away from heart disease, Evelyn accepted the maintenance job partly to remain busy and partly because retirement left too much room for old memories. She never imagined those memories would one day walk through the front entrance wearing an expensive tailored suit. The first time Evelyn noticed Daniel Carter's birthmark had been almost 2 years earlier. He had stepped from an elevator while speaking on his cell phone. As he turned his head to greet another executive, sunlight passing through the lobby windows briefly illuminated the small crescent-shaped mark beneath his ear. Evelyn stopped pushing her cleaning cart. Her heart skipped. For one impossible second, she remembered the delivery room. She remembered kissing the exact same birthmark moments before nurses carried her newborn away. The memory frightened her so deeply, she convinced herself it couldn't be real. Thousands of children are born with birthmarks. Memory plays cruel tricks. Coincidences happen every day. She forced herself to keep walking. But over the following 2 years, every glimpse of Daniel reopened the same impossible question. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here on Inner Scene Tales, we explore the hidden choices, impossible secrets, and life-changing moments that remind us how fragile certainty can really be. Because every family has a story they proudly tell the world, and sometimes another story buried so deeply that even the people living it no longer recognize the truth. Eventually, she began quietly observing him from a distance, not stalking him, simply watching. The way he smiled, the way he tilted his head while listening, the quiet kindness he showed employees others ignored. Each observation reminded her painfully of the little boy she had never been allowed to know. Still, she never approached him. Until that Monday morning. The boardroom door had been left slightly open while she polished the hallway windows nearby. Daniel laughed at something one of his directors had said. He turned his head. The birthmark became fully visible. Something inside Evelyn finally broke. Without thinking, she stepped inside. Her cleaning cart rolled quietly behind her. She looked directly into Daniel Carter's eyes. And before 48 years of unanswered grief could stop her, she whispered the words that changed both of their lives forever. "You're my son." The whisper should have been too soft for anyone to hear, yet somehow every conversation inside the executive boardroom died at the same moment. The silence arrived first, then the confusion, then the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping against the floor as one of the directors stood up in disbelief. Daniel Carter stared at the elderly maid standing in the doorway, trying to process what had just happened. Her hands trembled as she gripped the handle of her cleaning cart, but her eyes never moved from the birthmark beneath his ear. Daniel reached up instinctively and touched the crescent-shaped mark. He had done that gesture thousands of times throughout his life without thinking. This time, it felt different. This time, it felt as though someone had attached a question to it. One of the directors cleared his throat awkwardly. Another glanced toward the door, clearly wondering whether security should be called. Daniel finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I think you may have mistaken me for someone else." The woman shook her head slowly. Tears had already begun filling her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I could never mistake that birthmark." The room remained frozen. Daniel had spent decades handling hostile negotiations, aggressive investors, and public scrutiny without losing composure. Yet nothing in his professional life had prepared him for this. He forced a polite smile and turned toward the head of human resources. "Could someone please help Ms. Brooks?" he said carefully. "I think she's upset." Evelyn Brooks didn't move. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Just let me ask you one question." Daniel hesitated. Every executive in the room watched him. Finally, he nodded. "What's your birthday?" she asked. The question seemed harmless enough. Daniel answered automatically. "August 14th, 1978. Evelyn closed her eyes. A quiet sob escaped her lips. When she opened them again, she looked both relieved and devastated. "That's my son's birthday," she said. Daniel felt a chill move through his body. Coincidences happen every day, he told himself. Birthdays overlap. Birthmarks overlap. None of this means anything. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt a small crack forming in the certainty he had always carried about his past. The meeting ended abruptly. Daniel apologized to the board, postponed the remaining agenda items, and asked everyone to leave. Within minutes, the massive conference room was empty except for Daniel and Evelyn. Sunlight stretched across the polished table between them. Daniel remained standing. Evelyn remained near the doorway, as though afraid getting any closer might make the moment disappear. "Tell me exactly what you mean," Daniel said finally. Evelyn took a deep breath. "I gave birth to a boy on August 14th, 1978. He had that birthmark. Right here." She pointed beneath her own left ear. "The doctors told me he died." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, but my parents adopted me after my biological parents were killed in a car accident." Evelyn's face fell. "That's what they told you?" "Yes." "Did you ever see any records?" Daniel frowned. "My parents handled everything." "Did you ever see a death certificate for your biological parents?" "No." "Did you ever see your original birth records?" "No." Each answer made him more uncomfortable. He realized he had accepted an entire history without ever examining it, not because he was careless, because he had trusted the people who raised him completely. That evening, Daniel drove home in silence. The city skyline blurred past his windshield, while Evelyn's questions repeated in his mind. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he had convinced himself the entire encounter was a misunderstanding. He walked inside expecting the comfort of normal life. Instead, Laura immediately noticed something was wrong. "You're home early," she said. "How did the board meeting go?" Daniel loosened his tie. "Strange." Laura set down the dish towel she was holding. "What happened?" He hesitated. The story sounded ridiculous even in his own head. "One of the cleaning staff recognized a birthmark on my neck and claimed I'm her son." Laura blinked. "What?" Daniel gave a short, uneasy laugh. "Exactly." But Laura didn't laugh. She studied his face carefully. "And why are you so shaken up?" Daniel looked away. "Because she knew my birthday." The room became quiet. Laura crossed her arms. "That could still be a coincidence." "I know. But," Daniel sighed, "I've never actually seen any adoption records. I just believed what my parents told me." Laura walked closer and placed a hand on his arm. "Your parents loved you. I know they did. Then maybe that's all that matters." Daniel nodded, but the reassurance didn't settle the unease growing inside him. The next morning, he arrived at the office before sunrise. He told himself he was simply being practical. He wanted closure. He wanted proof. He asked Human Resources for Evelyn Brooks' employment file and requested a private meeting. When Evelyn entered his office, she looked exhausted, as though she hadn't slept at all. Daniel gestured toward a chair. "I need to ask you something." She sat quietly. "Why did you wait 2 years to say anything?" Evelyn looked down at her hands. "Because I thought I was imagining it." 2 years? I saw the birthmark the first week you moved into this building. Daniel stared at her. And you said nothing? I was terrified. Her voice trembled. Imagine believing your child died 48 years ago, and then seeing a man with the same birthmark, the same birthday, and the same eyes. Daniel felt his throat tighten. You really believe I'm your son? I know what I saw in that hospital. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Then tell me everything. For the next hour, Evelyn told him about St. Matthew's County Hospital, the difficult labor, the brief glimpse of her newborn, the birthmark, the doctor who told her the baby had died, the funeral she never attended because she was told it had already been arranged, the years of grief that followed. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he remained silent for a long time. Finally, he opened a drawer and removed a framed photograph of his adoptive parents. These are the people who raised me, he said softly. Evelyn looked at the picture. They look kind. They were. Then I'm glad. Daniel frowned. Glad? If you really are my son, then at least you were loved. The answer caught him off guard. He had expected desperation, anger, or demands. Instead, he found a woman who seemed more relieved than anything else. I'm not saying I believe this, Daniel said carefully. I understand, but I need to know the truth. Evelyn nodded. So do I. That afternoon, Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. He called a private investigator named Marcus Hale, a former detective known for handling sensitive family cases. Marcus arrived at the office carrying a leather notebook and the skeptical expression of a man who had heard every strange story imaginable. Daniel explained the situation from beginning to end. Marcus listened without reacting. When Daniel finished, Marcus asked a single question. Do you want me to prove she's wrong or prove she's right? Daniel stared at the window. I want the truth. Marcus nodded. Then we start with the adoption records. Before leaving, he added one more sentence. If this woman is telling the truth, someone lied to both of you. And people usually don't hide a lie for 48 years unless they're protecting something much bigger. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He went downstairs and opened the old photo albums his mother had labeled so carefully. First steps, first day of school, summer at Cape Cod. He turned the pages slowly. Every memory felt real, every smile felt genuine. Yet for the first time, he noticed something missing. There was no photograph of him as a newborn. The earliest picture showed him sitting in a high chair, already several months old. He searched every album. Nothing. No hospital photo. No adoption ceremony. No picture of his parents holding him as an infant. His chest tightened. Laura found him sitting on the living room floor surrounded by albums. Daniel? He looked up. There aren't any baby pictures. Laura frowned. What? Not one. She sat beside him and began flipping through the albums herself. After several minutes, her expression changed. That is strange. Daniel closed the album slowly. What if my parents didn't tell me everything? Laura reached for his hand. Maybe they had a reason. Daniel looked at the birthmark reflected faintly in the dark window beside him. For the first time in his life, he realized he didn't know whether the story he had built his identity around was true. And somewhere in another part of the city, an elderly maid was lying awake wondering whether the son she had mourned for nearly half a century had finally come home. The first report from private investigator Marcus Hale arrived only 4 days later. Daniel had expected a thin folder containing copies of adoption records and perhaps a few outdated hospital documents. Instead, Marcus walked into Daniel's office carrying 3 thick binders, an old leather briefcase, and an expression that immediately made Daniel's stomach tighten. This isn't going to be simple, Marcus said quietly, as he placed everything on the conference table. Daniel looked at the mountain of paperwork. What did you find? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the first binder and slid a yellow document across the polished table. I couldn't find your original adoption file. Daniel frowned. What do you mean you couldn't find it? I mean, Marcus paused. It doesn't exist. Daniel stared at him. That's impossible. It should be impossible. Marcus nodded. But it's missing. Daniel leaned forward. Missing because it's old? Marcus slowly shook his head. No, it was intentionally removed. Those words settled heavily inside the room. For nearly 50 years, Daniel had believed every detail of his childhood had been properly documented. Now someone was telling him that the very records proving who he was had disappeared. Marcus continued, "I've investigated hundreds of adoption cases. Old records get damaged. They get misplaced. Sometimes entire archives are destroyed by floods or fires. But this," he opened another folder, "is different." Daniel looked down. Inside were copies of county archive requests, hospital registry searches, probate filings, state adoption indexes. Each one carried the same response: no record found, not delayed, not incomplete, simply gone. Daniel slowly rubbed his forehead. "So, someone erased me." Marcus looked directly at him. "Someone erased the paperwork. They couldn't erase you." That sentence stayed with Daniel long after Marcus left. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Brooks sat inside her small kitchen, staring at a faded cardboard box she hadn't opened in years. The box contained almost everything she still possessed from the summer of 1978. A hospital bracelet, letters from friends, medical bills, one tiny knitted baby blanket. She carefully unfolded it. Her fingers traced the faded blue stitching. She remembered spending nearly 2 months making it herself while waiting for her baby to arrive. She had never allowed anyone to throw it away. Even after 48 years, grief has a strange relationship with time. It doesn't disappear. It simply learns how to wait. Evelyn opened another envelope. Inside rested the only photograph she had from that pregnancy. She was 19 years old, smiling nervously, one hand resting against her stomach. The back of the photograph carried one handwritten sentence. "For my little miracle." Tears quietly filled her eyes. Until Daniel appeared, she had finally accepted that miracles belonged to other people. For Marcus wasn't finished. 2 days later, he returned carrying another file. This time, he looked genuinely disturbed. "I found the doctor." Daniel looked up immediately. "The one from the hospital?" Marcus nodded. "Dr. Samuel Whitaker. I found his death certificate." Daniel waited. Marcus continued. "He died 16 years ago." Daniel sighed. "So that's it." Marcus slowly shook his head. "No. I also found 3 lawsuits." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Lawsuits?" Marcus slid newspaper clippings across the table. Each headline came from different years, different newspapers, different families, but every story involved the same hospital, St. Matthew's County Hospital. One article described missing newborn medical records. Another mentioned switched laboratory files. Another referred to unexplained adoption paperwork. None of the lawsuits had ever reached trial. Every case had quietly disappeared. Daniel read each article twice. "Why have I never heard about this?" Marcus answered honestly, "Because nobody wanted anyone to." Thug. That evening, Daniel drove somewhere he hadn't visited in almost 5 years, the cemetery where his adoptive parents rested. The sun had already begun setting. Long shadows stretched across rows of polished headstones. He carried fresh flowers. As he stood before Margaret and Thomas Carter's grave, he suddenly realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't visiting simply to remember them. He had questions. Questions they could no longer answer. He knelt quietly. "I don't know what happened." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't know if you knew. I don't know if someone lied to you too." The wind gently moved through the trees. Daniel closed his eyes. "You loved me. That much I know. But," his voice cracked, "where did I come from?" No answer came. Only silence. Yet somehow, the silence felt different now. Not empty. Patient. Almost as though the truth had been waiting decades for someone to finally ask the right question. Laura watched her husband changing. He no longer laughed as easily. Business dinners became shorter. Board meetings ended early. He spent evenings surrounded by old documents instead of financial reports. One night, she finally asked the question she had been avoiding. What happens if she's right? Daniel looked at her. I don't know. Laura hesitated. And if she is, does that change who you are? Daniel thought for a long time. Finally, he answered. It shouldn't. But somehow, it already has. Laura reached across the table. It doesn't matter whose blood you carry. You're still my husband. Daniel smiled faintly. I hope I still know who that is. The investigation soon reached another unexpected obstacle. St. Matthew's County Hospital no longer existed. The building had been demolished nearly 20 years earlier. Luxury condominiums now stood where the maternity ward once operated. Every hallway, every delivery room, every nursery, gone. Daniel stood across the street staring at the modern apartment complex. People walked dogs. Children played nearby. Cars entered an underground parking garage. Nobody passing that corner knew dozens of families had once begun their lives there, or perhaps lost them there. Marcus stood beside him. I've been thinking. Daniel turned. If records disappeared, if lawsuits disappeared, and if multiple families reported similar problems, Marcus paused. This probably wasn't one mistake. Daniel slowly nodded. What are you saying? Marcus looked directly at him. I'm saying, someone may have been selling babies. The words seemed impossible. Daniel almost laughed. Not because they were funny, because they sounded unbelievable. Until Marcus handed him one final document. A federal investigation, opened in 1984, closed without charges. Subject: unlicensed infant placements connected to St. Matthew's County Hospital. Daniel felt the ground beneath his certainty begin to disappear once again. He had spent weeks wondering whether Evelyn Brooks might actually be his biological mother. Now another possibility emerged. If babies had truly been taken, how many families had spent decades mourning children who had never actually died? And if someone had built an entire network around those disappearances, who had protected it for nearly half a century? Daniel realized he was no longer searching for his past. He was uncovering a secret far larger than his own life. And somewhere, someone was hoping he would stop looking before he discovered the rest of the truth. Daniel Carter had spent weeks chasing records that no longer existed, interviewing people whose memories had faded with time, and questioning the story he had accepted since childhood. Yet despite everything Marcus Hale had uncovered, one simple fact refused to change. There was still no proof that Evelyn Brooks was his biological mother. There were missing documents, suspicious lawsuits, a vanished hospital, even whispers of an illegal adoption network. But suspicion, no matter how convincing, could never replace evidence. Daniel understood that better than anyone. His entire career had been built on facts, contracts, and documentation. Feelings could influence decisions, but they could never prove them. As much as he wanted answers, he refused to build his life around assumptions. If Evelyn was right, he wanted to know with certainty, and if she was wrong, she deserved certainty too. There had already been enough lives shaped by unanswered questions. Marcus arrived at Daniel's office carrying a small envelope instead of another thick binder. Daniel immediately noticed it. No paperwork today? Marcus placed the envelope on the desk. No. What is it? The only evidence left that doesn't rely on missing files. Daniel looked at the envelope without touching it. A DNA test. The room became silent. Daniel leaned back slowly. It seemed obvious now. They had searched through decades of paperwork while overlooking the one piece of evidence capable of answering the central question. Marcus spoke carefully. If Evelyn agrees, this could tell us whether she's your biological mother. Daniel remained quiet. A positive result wouldn't simply answer one question. It would destroy another. The story his parents had told him his entire life. The story they themselves may have believed. Or perhaps, the story they had chosen to protect. I'll ask her, Daniel finally said. Marcus nodded. And whatever the result, at least you'll stop wondering. Evelyn didn't hesitate. When Daniel explained the DNA test over coffee inside a quiet neighborhood cafe, she agreed before he even finished the sentence. I've waited 48 years, She smiled sadly. I can wait a few more weeks. Daniel looked at her carefully. Aren't you afraid? She laughed softly. Terrified. Of being wrong? Evelyn shook her head. No. She looked directly into Daniel's eyes. I'm afraid of being right. Daniel understood exactly what she meant, because he felt the same fear. If the test proved they weren't related, both of them could finally move on. If it proved they were, nothing would ever be the same again. The samples were collected the following morning. Neither of them spoke much afterward. There was nothing left to say. Science would now answer the question that memory never could. The laboratory estimated 3 weeks. Daniel had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions that closed faster than that. Yet those 21 days became the longest of his life. He found himself unable to concentrate during meetings. Investors noticed. Employees noticed. Even reporters covering his company began asking whether something was wrong. Daniel answered every question exactly the same way. I'm handling a personal matter. He offered nothing more. Laura watched quietly as her husband drifted further into uncertainty. One evening she found him standing inside the attic surrounded by old boxes, photo albums, school certificates, birthday cards. Every piece of his childhood had suddenly become evidence. Laura climbed the attic stairs. What are you looking for? Daniel didn't answer immediately. I don't know. She walked beside him. He picked up an old Christmas photograph. I keep wondering whether my parents knew. Laura gently took the picture from his hands. They loved you. I know. They celebrated every birthday. I know. They stayed awake when you were sick. I know. She placed the photograph back into its box. Don't let questions erase everything that was real. Daniel looked at her. I don't want to. But if they lied, Laura interrupted gently. What if they were lied to? Daniel stopped speaking. He hadn't allowed himself to consider that possibility. Perhaps Margaret and Thomas Carter had never stolen anyone's child. Perhaps they had simply believed the adoption agency. Perhaps they had loved him without ever knowing another family had spent decades grieving. For the first time since meeting Evelyn, Daniel hoped his parents had been innocent. Marcus continued investigating while waiting for the laboratory results. He traveled across 3 different states, interviewing retired nurses, former hospital employees, and anyone connected to St. Matthews County Hospital during the late 1970s. Most conversations ended the same way. I don't remember. It was too long ago. I wasn't involved. Then, everything changed. A retired nurse agreed to meet him. Her name was Patricia Collins. She was 81 years old, living quietly inside a retirement community in Vermont. Marcus expected another dead end. Instead, Patricia asked a question before he had even introduced himself. Is this about the babies? Marcus froze. You know what I'm talking about? She closed her eyes. I've spent 40 years hoping someone would ask. Marcus immediately switched on his recorder. Patricia spoke slowly. There were rumors. What kind of rumors? She looked toward the window. Healthy babies. Marcus frowned. What about them? They disappeared. He remained silent. The mothers were told the babies didn't survive. Marcus felt every instinct sharpen. Did you witness this yourself? Patricia hesitated. I never saw a baby taken. But I saw files changed. I saw birth bracelets disappear. I saw doctors ordering nurses not to ask questions. Marcus leaned forward. Why didn't you report it? Patricia looked ashamed. I was 23. I was afraid. Everyone with authority told us we were imagining things. She paused. And back then, young nurses didn't accuse respected doctors. Marcus asked the question that mattered most. Do you remember Dr. Samuel Whitaker? Patricia looked down immediately. I remember him. What was he like? He always knew which couples couldn't have children. Marcus frowned. What do you mean? He spent a great deal of time with private adoption agencies. The room became painfully quiet. Far more. Marcus returned to Boston carrying far more than notes. For the first time, he had a witness, not proof, but someone whose memories matched every suspicious record he had uncovered. When Daniel finished listening to Patricia's interview, he sat silently for several minutes. Finally, he asked, "Do you think this happened to me?" Marcus answered honestly, "I think we're getting closer, but we're not there yet." Then, the laboratory called. Daniel answered immediately. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes. This is North Atlantic Genetics." Daniel stood. His heart pounded so loudly he barely heard the next sentence. "Your results are ready." He closed his office door. "Can you tell me now?" "I'm sorry. Our policy requires results to be released in person." Daniel closed his eyes. "When?" "As soon as tomorrow morning." After the call ended, he remained standing beside the window overlooking the city. One piece of paper. One scientific report. 48 years of questions. By this time tomorrow, he would either lose the mother he had just found, or discover he had lost her nearly half a century ago. He wasn't sure which possibility frightened him more. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn sat quietly inside her living room, holding the tiny blue baby blanket she had refused to throw away. She whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken in decades, not asking for her son to come back, not asking for justice, only asking for the strength to accept whatever truth tomorrow would bring. Neither of them slept that night. Both understood that by sunrise, one chapter of their lives would finally end, but neither realized the DNA results would answer only the first mystery. The second would prove even more devastating. The following morning arrived with a silence that neither Daniel Carter nor Evelyn Brooks had experienced before. Neither of them rushed. Neither of them called the laboratory. Neither of them tried to prepare for what waited ahead. Some truths are too large to rehearse. Daniel drove alone. The city moved around him exactly as it had every other weekday. Parents hurried children toward school. Coffee shops filled with commuters. Construction crews blocked intersections. Business executives walked quickly toward office buildings with phones pressed against their ears. Everything appeared painfully ordinary. Yet Daniel couldn't stop thinking about one question. By noon, would he still be the same man? Evelyn arrived at the genetics laboratory 20 minutes early. She sat quietly in the waiting room, her hands folded across the faded blue baby blanket she had carried inside a small handbag. The receptionist smiled politely. "You can leave your belongings here if you'd like." Evelyn gently shook her head. No, she wasn't carrying a blanket. She was carrying 48 years of hope. Daniel entered moments later. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. There was nothing comforting left to say. A technician eventually appeared. "Mr. Carter? Ms. Brooks? Please follow me." The consultation room felt unusually small. A single round table. 3 chairs. 1 sealed envelope. The genetic counselor sat across from them. "I've reviewed your results carefully." Daniel noticed her choosing every word with unusual caution. "Our laboratory repeated the analysis twice." He frowned. "Twice?" "The result was significant enough that we wanted absolute certainty." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. The counselor slowly opened the envelope. She placed one document between them. Her eyes met Daniel's. "There is a..." Brief pause. 99.998% probability that Evelyn Brooks is your biological mother." The room disappeared. Daniel didn't hear the next sentence. He didn't notice Evelyn beginning to cry. He simply stared at the numbers. 48 years. Reduced to one scientific conclusion. She had been telling the truth. Evelyn covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "I knew it." She whispered it almost apologetically. "I knew it." Daniel looked at her. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at the woman who had carried him. The woman whose heartbeat had been the first sound he had ever known. Neither of them moved. Neither knew how. Finally, Daniel stood. He slowly walked around the table. Without speaking, he embraced her. Evelyn broke down completely. She cried the way only someone who had spent nearly half a century mourning a living child could cry. "I thought you died." She could barely breathe between words. They told me you never took your first breath. Daniel closed his eyes. I know. No. She shook her head. You don't. She looked into his face. I buried an empty future. I spent birthdays wondering how old you would have been. I imagined your graduation, your wedding, your children. I mourned memories that never happened. Daniel couldn't answer, because there was no sentence powerful enough to respond to that kind of grief. Marcus Hale received the DNA confirmation less than an hour later. Instead of celebrating, he became even more focused. If she's your biological mother, he looked at Daniel. Then someone committed a crime. Daniel nodded. And if it happened to me, Marcus finished the sentence. It happened to other families too. The investigation expanded immediately. Federal archives were reopened. Old court filings resurfaced. Marcus began contacting families connected to St. Matthews County Hospital during the late 1970s. Within 3 weeks, 7 women came forward. Every story sounded disturbingly familiar. Healthy pregnancy, unexpected complications, brief separation from the baby, hospital staff delivering devastating news, no opportunity to see the child's body, rapid cremation, closed records, no photographs, no death certificate signed by the attending physician, only paperwork that now appeared increasingly suspicious. Marcus covered an entire wall inside his office with photographs. 7 mothers, 7 infants, 7 unexplained deaths, or 7 disappearances. Daniel stared at the board. This can't be coincidence, Marcus quietly replied. It isn't. A breakthrough arrived from an unexpected place. A retired accountant contacted Marcus after seeing a newspaper article about Daniel's investigation. His name was Harold Benson. For nearly 15 years, he had worked for a private adoption agency that operated alongside St. Matthews County Hospital. I didn't know anything back then, Harold insisted. I handled bookkeeping. Marcus listened carefully. What changed? Harold opened an old ledger. I found these. Inside were handwritten financial records dating back nearly 50 years. Large payments, anonymous donors, private adoption fees, cash withdrawals. One particular column immediately caught Marcus's attention. Each payment shared identical initials. S.W. Dr. Samuel Whitaker. Marcus looked up slowly. These aren't medical payments. Harold nodded. They're commissions. The room became completely silent. Marcus asked carefully, commissions for what? Harold swallowed hard. I think, for babies. The ledger contained 23 suspicious transactions. Each one corresponded almost perfectly with dates involving unexplained newborn deaths. Daniel stared at the figures. Children, reduced to financial entries. Marcus continued investigating. Eventually, another discovery emerged. The couples receiving the infants weren't wealthy celebrities. They weren't criminals. Most were ordinary married couples struggling with infertility. People desperate to become parents. People willing to trust respected doctors. People who believed every legal document placed before them. Daniel suddenly asked the question nobody had considered. What if they were victims too? Marcus nodded. They probably were. That realization changed everything. The story no longer involved villains and innocent families. It involved several groups of innocent people, separated by one network of lies. Birth mothers, adoptive parents, children, all manipulated by individuals who profited from their suffering. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Margaret and Thomas Carter, the people who had raised him, the people buried beneath matching granite headstones. For weeks, he had quietly feared they had knowingly purchased another family's child. Now, that fear began fading. Marcus finally found their original application to adopt. It had been stored inside a private agency archive rather than county records. Daniel opened the file carefully. The first page described years of infertility, medical procedures, multiple miscarriages, heartbreak. letters from counselors, recommendations from church leaders. Everything reflected one overwhelming truth. Margaret and Thomas Carter had wanted a child, not someone else's child. Daniel continued reading. Near the back of the file, one handwritten sentence stopped him cold. The infant's biological mother requested complete anonymity following childbirth. Daniel closed the folder. His mother and father had believed every word. They had never known. They had spent 48 years loving a son they believed had been legally placed into their care. Daniel quietly wiped away tears. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he no longer questioned their love. He questioned the people who had stolen everyone's truth. Weeks later, federal investigators officially reopened multiple cases connected to St. Matthew's County Hospital. News outlets across the country began reporting remarkable similarities. Other adults adopted during that era volunteered DNA. More biological families reunited. More missing records surfaced. The investigation grew larger every week. One evening, Daniel stood beside Evelyn outside the old cemetery where Margaret and Thomas Carter rested. She carried fresh flowers. Daniel looked surprised. "You wanted to come here?" Evelyn nodded. "They raised my son." She smiled sadly. "I've spent 48 years wishing someone loved you." She gently placed the flowers beside Margaret's grave. "Now I know someone did." Daniel felt tears fill his eyes once again. Two mothers, neither enemies, both victims. One lost a child. The other believed she had finally found one. For the first time, Daniel realized that love had never been the problem. The lie had been. But the greatest revelation was still waiting. Because investigators had finally discovered who had organized the entire operation. And the name at the top of the documents wasn't Dr. Samuel Whitaker. It belonged to someone still alive. Someone who had quietly built a respected life, while dozens of families spent decades mourning children who had never actually died. The investigation reached its final turning point almost 3 months after Daniel Carter first met Evelyn Brooks. By then, the story had spread far beyond Massachusetts. Television stations covered every development. National newspapers revisited decades-old adoption practices. Hundreds of families contacted investigators, wondering whether their own histories contained similar unanswered questions. Some hoped for miracles. Others feared them. Daniel watched the coverage from the quiet of his office. Only months earlier, his greatest concern had been quarterly earnings and board meetings. Now his name had become part of a national conversation about identity, family, and one of the darkest betrayals imaginable. Yet despite everything investigators had uncovered, one question remained unanswered. Who had orchestrated it all? Everyone assumed the answer had died with Dr. Samuel Whitaker. Everyone, except Marcus Hale. Marcus had spent weeks tracing financial records that stretched back nearly 5 decades. Unlike hospital files, money left a trail. Companies changed names, accounts were closed, properties were sold. But somewhere, someone had been paid. Late one evening, Marcus called Daniel. "I found him." Daniel sat upright. "Who?" "The man who owned the agency." Daniel frowned. "I thought the agency shut down." "It did." Marcus paused. "But its founder didn't disappear. He simply changed businesses." Daniel listened carefully. He spent the last 30 years building one of the largest fertility consulting firms in New England. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "A fertility consultant?" Marcus nodded. "The same man who once helped desperate couples adopt children. Later became one of the state's most respected fertility specialists." His name was Richard Langston, 78 years old, award-winning philanthropist, hospital donor, university trustee, recipient of multiple humanitarian awards. To the public, Richard Langston had dedicated his life to helping families. Behind closed doors, investigators now believed he had helped destroy dozens of them. Federal investigators moved quickly. Search warrants were issued. Corporate archives were seized. Storage facilities were opened. Inside one forgotten warehouse on the outskirts of Hartford, Investigators found hundreds of boxes, every box carefully labeled by year, every file preserved, every payment documented. There were birth records, adoption contracts, private correspondence, financial ledgers, even photographs. Marcus stood silently as investigators opened the first cabinet. One detective looked toward him. "I've never seen anything like this." Marcus hadn't either. Richard Langston hadn't destroyed the evidence. He had archived it. Perhaps he believed nobody would ever come looking. Perhaps after 50 years, he assumed everyone involved had either died or forgotten. He underestimated one thing: a mother's memory. Among the files was one sealed envelope marked simply, "Infant Male, July 1978. Marcus carefully opened it. Inside rested Daniel's original birth bracelet, his footprint card, his first medical examination, and his original birth certificate. Not Daniel Carter. Daniel Brooks. Mother, Evelyn Brooks. Father, unknown. Marcus closed the file and quietly exhaled. 48 years. One envelope. An entire lifetime hidden inside a dusty filing cabinet. Richard Langston was arrested 2 days later. He arrived at the federal courthouse surrounded by cameras. Reporters shouted questions from every direction. Did you sell babies? How many families were affected? Did hospitals know? Richard never answered. He simply lowered his head and continued walking. For the first time in decades, the man who had controlled everyone else's stories had lost control of his own. During questioning, investigators expected denial. Instead, Richard surprised everyone. "I never kidnapped children." The lead investigator remained silent. Richard continued, "I created families." The room became still. He genuinely believed it. He described infertile couples, young mothers, complicated pregnancies, legal loopholes, paperwork. He never referred to babies. He referred to placements, opportunities, solutions. The investigator interrupted him. "You told mothers their children had died." Richard looked down. "They were young. They would have struggled. You stole children." "I gave them better lives." The investigator leaned forward. "You stole their choice." Richard said nothing. Sometimes, the most dangerous people aren't those who believe they're evil. They're those who convince themselves they're doing good. The criminal proceedings lasted nearly a year. Richard Langston died from natural causes before the final sentencing. Many families felt cheated. There would never be complete justice. But justice had never been only about prison. Sometimes, justice begins with the truth. Daniel finally received every document connected to his birth. He spent hours reading through them. The delivery records, the altered certificates, the forged signatures, the adoption approvals. Each page represented another decision made without his mother's knowledge, without his own. Then he found something unexpected. A handwritten note clipped to Margaret Carter's adoption application. "We are so grateful. We promise this little boy will know love every day of his life." Unsigned. But Daniel recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. Margaret Carter. He quietly smiled through tears. She had kept her promise. Several weeks later, Daniel invited Evelyn to the home where he had raised his own children. Family photographs still lined the walls, graduation portraits, Christmas mornings, summer vacations. Laura welcomed Evelyn with a warm embrace. No awkwardness, no resentment, only compassion. Daniel's children were nervous at first. They didn't know what to call her. Grandmother? Mrs. Brooks? Evelyn noticed immediately. She smiled. "You can call me Evelyn." The youngest granddaughter walked over. "Can I still hug you?" Evelyn's eyes filled instantly. "I was hoping you would." The little girl wrapped both arms around her. For a brief moment, 48 years of loss gave way to something entirely new. Not replacement, not recovery. A beginning. Months later, Congress announced a nationwide review of historical adoption procedures connected to several hospitals operating during the 1970s and 1980s. New DNA assistance programs helped reunite additional families. Some stories ended with joyful reunions. Others ended with painful confirmation that loved ones had already passed away. Not every family received a miracle. But every family finally received the chance to search. Daniel's company returned to normal operations. He resumed board meetings, business interviews, public appearances. Yet something fundamental had changed. Whenever journalists asked him about success, he no longer spoke about wealth, or growth, or market value. Instead, he said something much simpler. The greatest investment you'll ever make is in the people who know the real you. Years later, Daniel often visited Evelyn on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they sat quietly on the porch, watching the sunset. There was no urgency anymore. No investigation. No missing documents. No unanswered questions. Only time. Time they could never recover. But time they refused to waste. One afternoon, Evelyn laughed while looking through old family albums. "You know, I missed 48 birthdays," Daniel smiled. "We've got plenty left." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'd like that." When people hear stories like Daniel Carter's, they often ask the same question. How could something like this happen? But perhaps there is another question worth asking. How many people spend their lives believing they know exactly who they are, without realizing one hidden truth could change everything? Identity isn't built only from blood, nor only from memory. It is built from love, choice, sacrifice, and the courage to face the truth, even when it reshapes your entire past. Daniel eventually discovered that he had two mothers. One gave him life, the other gave him a childhood. Neither had stolen him from the other. Both had been robbed by the same lie. In the end, the birthmark that stopped one elderly maid from walking away didn't simply reunite a mother and her son. It exposed a deception that had survived nearly half a century. One whispered sentence, "You're my son." One decision to search for the truth. And dozens of families finally received answers they had waited a lifetime to hear. Perhaps that's why the truth has such remarkable power. It may arrive late. It may demand more than we think we can bear. But once it finally steps into the light, no lie, no matter how carefully preserved, can ever make it disappear again.